When I first started this channel, believe it or not, I had never actually disliked 2 AC games in a row. Anytime an entry really disappointed me, Ubisoft had a tendency to come out swinging with the next one. But then Valhalla came out, and it quickly took its place as my least favorite game in the series, and Mirage didn't impress me much as a follow-up. So suddenly, it was 2025, and 7 years had passed since Odyssey, the last one I really did enjoy. As a result, at a personal level, I was putting a lot of weight on Assassin's Creed Shadows, the game that would finally take fans to the Feudal Japan setting that had been so highly requested for a decade and a half. Clearly I wasn't the only one putting that kind of pressure on Shadows. Ubisoft has been going through some very public financial struggles, and they have seemingly decided to put a lot of their eggs in the Assassin's Creed basket in the hopes it'll save them. On the other side of the spectrum, it has been impossible to avoid constant clickbait headlines going over the many controversies this game has stirred up since before it was even announced. So many people arguing back and forth about the game, some with very legitimate concerns, but many jumping at the chance for some blatant content farming. Online discussion of Shadows was very unpleasant, so by and large, I opted to ignore it. But I got a review code for the game from Ubisoft at the beginning of March, and while most reviews went up last week when the embargo was up, I gave myself a bit more time so I could make this a non-spoiler review of my complete experience with the game, from booting it up to getting the Platinum Trophy. Having now done everything I consider worth doing in the game, it feels very anticlimactic to say that after all the noise and fanfare, Assassin's Creed Shadows is just fine. I want to be very transparent about what I mean when I say fine. I do think Shadows is a major improvement over Valhalla in pretty much every way. It is a beautiful and technically sound game. I also think it pales in comparison to both Origins and Odyssey, retreading a ton of mistakes I thought Ubisoft had moved past and coming up with some new ones of its own. My biggest issue is not that I was upset playing Shadows, but instead that I rarely felt anything at all during my playthrough. It is both one of the most polished AC games and one of the least creative. The open-world gameplay loop of riding from question mark to question mark is cleaner than it has ever been, but that only means so much when the narrative and activities are, in my opinion, at their most generic and uninspired. As a result, while it is clearly a better game than many AC titles before it, Shadows has sadly made less of an impression on me, good or bad, than any other game in this series. I do want to say that there are a lot of aspects of this game that land very well. First off, it was a breath of fresh air that it took me 60 hours to do pretty much everything in the game and get the Platinum Trophy, which is pretty much in line with the length of Origins, about 30 hours fewer than the base game of Odyssey took me, and about 80 hours fewer than the base game for Valhalla. The series has had a destructive, bigger means better mentality for too long now, and I appreciate that the game is more respectful of my time. If you are into trophy or achievement hunting, you might know that Valhalla is infamous for being a slog to complete to 100%. The trophies for Shadows are comparatively much less annoying, pushing you to get a fully rounded experience, but not forcing you to touch every single icon on the map. Unfortunately, it seems like you need to be online for a trophy to pop. There were several instances where I wasn't connected to the internet, and so I wouldn't get a trophy until I reconnected and reloaded the game. Now, whether or not this means you can miss out on trophies entirely is unknown to me. I didn't end up missing any, they all came eventually, but I have no clue why Ubisoft did this either way. I really hope they change it. Going into the map itself, it is smaller than both Odyssey and Valhalla in both physical size and scope, which I think is a good thing. Instead of trying to condense the entirety of a country into a playable map like the last few games, Shadows limits its focus to the Kansai region of Japan, spanning from the Ki province to the north of Lake Biwa. In some ways, this makes the world feel bigger. Ancient Greece was really cool, but it felt weird that from some vantage points you could see clear across to both ends of the country. In Shadows, each area feels reasonably large and meaningful in of itself, and it doesn't make the mistake of feeling like a miniaturized diorama version of the setting. When Valhalla came out, I said in my review that it probably had the most beautiful landscapes of any AC game, and after exploring the entirety of the map of Shadows corner to corner, I don't think it's unfair to say that this game has it beat. There are some breathtaking visuals here, ranging from secluded temples to the many castle Tenshu to stretches of serene farmland. and there was an emptiness to Valhalla that Shadows mostly avoids, doing a good job of making sure pretty much every area on the map feels like it has a purpose other than to just take up space. It also helps that the performance was solid for me on my vanilla PS5. I'm not going to go deep into this stuff, I'm not the person to do a technical review, I'm sure Digital Foundry has stuff you can watch if you're looking for that, but unlike Valhalla, my experience with Shadows was consistently bug-free, and I didn't notice any frame dips at all. While there is a little less environmental diversity due to the comparatively small area the map encompasses, the game makes up for this with the season system. There are essentially 4 different versions of the world map with substantially different visual feels, and whether the map is covered with a blanket of snow or rows of cherry blossoms, I found that it was consistently gorgeous. It is also a much more grounded setting than some of the recent ones. One thing I won't speak too much in depth to is historical accuracy, because it's not my place to, but it is clear that this game makes a point to avoid the more fantastical elements we've seen in the last few titles. Shadows doesn't have 100-foot statues, ahistorical aqueducts, or boss battles with gods, and weapons aren't so oversized that they have to shrink when the main character sheathes them. So obviously, a lot of stuff that it does right. That said, I do have some sizable issues with this setting. My first video on this channel was a ranking of the settings in these games, and if I were to remake that video right now, I don't think I could justify putting this version of Feudal Japan very high. And I'd say the main reason is the cities. Urban areas in this game just have so little identity to distinguish one from the other. You can take a game like Odyssey, a game where I don't think the cities are especially impressive, and see that the devs still put a lot of effort into making places like Argos, Athens, and Sparta feel unique from one another. You can look up rankings online where people talk about what their favorite cities in Odyssey are. I don't really see how that would even be possible in Shadows, where each city feels pretty generic and they all blend together in my head. I was looking for missions that would explore the unique culture or industry of each location, or shops and activities that only exist in particular places. Instead, walking around Kyoto, the capital of the country at the time, feels pretty identical to walking around any random country town. I was playing some Ocarina of Time recently, and it's incredible how much more alive Castletown on the N64 feels than the real-life urban hub of Japan in the 1500s here in Shadows. Once again, I can't speak to the accuracy of a TV show like Shogun, but in that show, the city of Osaka is portrayed as dense, sprawling, and bustling. It feels like a busy, dangerous city, and the show takes place less than 20 years after AC Shadows does. When I see something like that, it leaves me feeling like it wasn't accuracy that led to these sparse, boring cities, and instead just a lack of effort, which isn't a good thing to feel. A big part of it is also the very low NPC density. There is no spot on the map where NPCs congregate in large numbers, meaning the cities feel no more densely populated than the rest of the world. It seems clear that over the past 10 years, the devs behind these games have been willing to sacrifice NPC count and NPC interactability for huge open maps, and I really don't care for it. I talked in a past video about the fact that this game and Ghost of Tsushima are obviously going to catch a lot of comparisons. One thing I stated Ubisoft could do to stand out was put a clear focus on the urban life and culture of mainland Japan, since Ghost of Tsushima was obviously confined to a single island. Unfortunately, in Shadows, you spend most of your time running through forests and hills and fields. Giving us significant content in the cities and making those cities feel lived in would have made the game stand out from any other historical fiction game set in Japan right now, and it feels like it falls short of its potential by ignoring so much of that. A lot of games have beautiful landscapes, but Assassin's Creed has long held its own niche by letting us explore cities that have been lost to time, and I wish they took advantage of that here. Instead, the stuff that this game does best when it comes to the world and visuals is oftentimes stuff that other games already do just as well, which is fine, it's just kind of disappointing. Like I said, the world is still well done. It is what the teams behind Assassin's Creed always do best. I could argue that this is the visual peak of the series. However, at the same time, it just feels a bit too one-note for my taste, and I wish more was done to make different regions stand out. For people who have wanted a game set in feudal Japan for a long time, there is plenty that this game nails. But if hills and scenic points don't excite you as much as cities and culture, the world that you're going to get with this map might leave you wanting. I mentioned earlier that AC Shadows plays things safe, and I see that most clearly in the basic gameplay loop. Individually, none of the side content in this game is bad. I had hours of fun exploring the world and seeing what it had to offer. But as the hours rack up, it falls into the same repetitive flow that pretty much every Ubisoft Formula game falls into. You run from icon to check them off, going places simply because there are question marks to unmask. In these games, I tend to separate the types of side content you can do into two categories. You have missions and you have activities. Missions are narrative side stories, while activities are tasks or mini-games you can complete in the open world. Shadows has plenty of activities to do. You can do a meditation or kata minigame, find animals to sneak up on and paint, pray at a shrine, collect scrolls, do a parkour path, engage in horse archery, loot tombs, or take down the usual forts and castles. It is not lacking for content. These activities are spaced out well enough, and they are nowhere near as overbearing as the ones in Valhalla. But I never felt excited to go out of my way to do these things. It was a lot of going to a place, pressing a few buttons, and then going to the next one. As unfair as it is, I think of games like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring, where a distinct landmark glimpsed out of the corner of your eye could lead to hours of totally optional content. Even Odyssey had a ton of surprises in store for the player who ventured off the beaten path, whereas Shadows is content with a map that acts as a task board of forts and quick-time events. A lot of the things you do in the open world reward you with either skill points, knowledge points, or loot, and loot has been controversial in this series, but as a point of praise, I think Shadows handles it pretty well. You don't get this oppressively constant flow of gear like Odyssey, but loot also doesn't feel useless like it kind of did in Valhalla. It is a solid balance where you are changing your gear regularly, but not at a breakneck pace, and just from a visual perspective, I have got to say that I have never felt cooler in an AC game than I have with some of Naoe's fits here. And so I felt adequately rewarded for doing side activities, but I didn't consistently find them fun, and I was hoping that side missions would pick up that slack. But the way Shadows handles its missions is really bizarre. Back in Odyssey, they introduced a cool mechanic where there would be random cultists scattered around the world, and it was like having dozens of open assassination contracts going at a time that you could meticulously work your way through, or even stumble upon at random. What Shadows does is it makes almost every single side mission in the game just this. By the time you get to the end of the game, it was comedic how enormous your assassination board is. I couldn't believe it when I was 50 hours into the game and meeting some random civilian somehow opened up a whole new set of people to kill. I kinda just wanted it to stop at a point, because I'll be honest, it gets old when kill random person is all the game is asking you to do for a dozen hours at a time. I know Odyssey and Origins threw way too many side quests at the player, but I missed having narrative arcs I could follow outside of the story. These come very rarely in Shadows, and that was disappointing. That isn't to say there are none at all. There are a few characters who have brief story quests over the course of the game, and each of your hideout members has a quest dedicated to them as well. A lot of AC games try to set up some kind of hub feature to varying levels of success, and Shadows is one of the better ones. You can somewhat design your own settlement, which is nice for any Animal Crossing fans out there, and you can recruit initiates to your cause in a way that is very reminiscent of how AC3 handled recruitment, where each one is a named character with their own story to complete in order to enlist them. Unfortunately, after the 20 to 30 minutes of story required to unlock them, you can use them in gameplay, but their narrative contribution essentially ends. I found myself wishing I had more reason to go back to the hideout. It never really felt like a home because all I was doing was seeing characters who didn't actually have any more story beats for me. When it comes to studios that make AC games, I actually have a somewhat unpopular opinion in that I have looked forward to Quebec titles more than Ubisoft Montreal titles recently. While I think it's fair to say that the best AC games were made by the Montreal teams, Quebec has always had this dedication to pure, unadulterated fun. Syndicate, Odyssey, and even Immortals are games where, despite their flaws, you can tell the devs were constantly thinking, what is the most fun thing we can have the player do here? Shadows, despite being a Ubisoft Quebec game, doesn't feel like that. While most of their games give you a world to play in, this game, like Valhalla before it, felt like it was giving me a lot of busy work, and it was disappointing to see that. The Ubisoft Formula gets a lot of flack for its repetition and lack of creativity, and so I was surprised, especially given how much seems to be riding on this game, by just how tightly Shadows sticks to the status quo. You would think a game that was supposed to be Ubisoft's big next-gen debut for the series would strive for more than an open world with some of the most forgettable side content in the franchise. Even as someone who honestly enjoys Ubisoft Formula titles, the side content and activities are one of the biggest reasons why the Japan of Shadows fades into the soup of samey open-world games for me. The gameplay of Shadows centers around the idea of two playstyles that you can switch between at any time, and I was happy to see that clear attempts were made to make these characters feel different, because the last time we had dual protagonists was Evie and Jacob, and they were 90% the same character mechanically. However, in practice, I don't think they found the right balance here. The idea behind it was that Naoe is the shinobi, and Yasuke is the samurai, so one character for stealth, and one for combat. But in practice, this isn't a 50-50 game about either sneaking or slashing. You are constantly traveling, climbing viewpoints, exploring, so on and so forth. It is an open-world game. The problem is that while Naoe can do pretty much everything with competence, Yasuke is kind of useless outside of combat. The team just didn't have to do so much to limit his non-combat abilities. He is incredibly slow when climbing and can only climb very small structures. He cannot balance on ropes because they break under the weight of his gear. He is significantly slower than Naoe. He cannot assassinate, and he doesn't have eagle vision. Many times I would be playing as Yasuke and realize he wasn't able to climb a particular viewpoint or couldn't scale a mountain I needed to pass, and by hour 20 I had given up on playing as Yasuke during the open world exploration entirely because I was constantly having to switch back to Naoe anyways. I get wanting your characters to be different, but playing as Yasuke is an active detriment for a vast majority of the game because his gameplay value is so narrow. Obviously, this isn't a great start if we're talking about the gameplay, but dual characters aside, how does it actually feel to play? I will once again reiterate that everything here is better than Valhalla, and this starts with the presentation of the game. The animations are smoother than they've been since the Kenway saga, in my opinion. No more slicing the air a meter away from the enemy. The game feels incredibly polished. That kind of clean animation work was always a staple of AC in the past, and I've missed it since long before Origins. If I had to point out the best part of the gameplay, I'd probably pick the stealth, which is good because you have to have some confidence in your stealth system if you're going to call your video game Shadows. First and foremost, it is fully functional, which should be the bare minimum, but Valhalla didn't reach that standard, so I have to mention it. The detection system never glitched out on me, tools worked as intended, and the level design actually feels built to facilitate stealthy play. There is an argument to be made that this is the cleanest that stealth has been in an AC game. The two big additions to the basic stealth framework are the ability to go prone and the ability to hide in shadows. Both of these add a layer of depth to sneaking around, and infiltrating a camp at night is actually radically different from doing so during the day. While I appreciate these additions, I found myself really wishing they had done more to integrate them into the full experience. In games like MGS5 or The Last of Us Part 2, I was constantly going prone because the level design called for it. Here, it was actually pretty rare for me to have a reason to go prone because places to sneak under or short grass were not actually that common compared to waist-high cover and bushes like the earlier games. Likewise, I wanted more from the shadow mechanic. Like I said in my preview video, I was really surprised by how many light sources you can't actually snuff out, making the whole mechanic feel kind of shallow. It took me a while to get used to hiding in shadows because at night you can hide in any shadow, pretty much, which looks really goofy. You're just standing in the middle of a hallway and it says you're hidden, even though you can see yourself perfectly clearly. It's a cool mechanic, and I don't mean to be nitpicky about something that I do like, but the biggest reason I'm being like this is that we've had great shadow-based stealth before with the Splinter Cell games 20 years ago, and it doesn't feel right that in 2025 the company is giving us an iteration that feels watered down from what they could do 2 decades ago. I will say, if you like stealth, play on the hardest difficulty. You can up combat and stealth difficulty separately. I don't usually give advice like that. I think looking for harder experiences is kind of a niche thing, but in this case it really changes the game. Guards are obviously more perceptive, but the real change for stealth, to me, is that they can see you on the rooftops. This means you can't just climb a one-story building and be totally safe. When you are required to actually get on the ground, hide in the shadows, and use the terrain, this is a much more enjoyable game. Another issue I have with the stealth is that certain abilities are tied to gear, and I really don't like that. For example, Naue has 3 weapon types, and each one has its own ability tied to it. You can only assassinate through doors with the katana, you can only do the rush assassination with the kusarigama, and you can only double assassinate with the tanto. And since you can only equip 2 weapons at a time, this means you have to forego one ability. This means I was constantly going back to the menu, changing my weapon or putting on a different hat or whatever, and then going back into gameplay. And in one of the preview videos Ubisoft put out before launch, this actually was the recommended way to get through certain situations.
Well, almost. Like I said, this die show's pretty strong, but no matter. A quick change of headgear with a particular perk that gives us 1 additional chunk of assassination damage on all air assassinations should do the trick.
I guess it's meant to add strategy, but it just adds busy work. I feel bad that I'm throwing so many criticisms at what is probably the best part of the game, but I think it is indicative of Ubisoft's entire approach to the game, as I mentioned in the intro. The devs made a really solid, clean version of the most generic aspects of their usual stealth system. Without things like shadows and going prone mattering as much as I would have hoped, you're left spending a lot of time assassinating from bushes and whistling from behind corners like pretty much every other open-world game for the past 10 years. That also makes it really stand out that some of the franchise's historically unique mechanics are not present. There is no social stealth, and while the marketing said there would be black boxes of a sort, I can't really say that's true. There was only one mainline assassination where I found a special opportunity to take out a target by making a dog bark and luring him into a private room. Otherwise, the assassinations are just regular linear missions like any other. It just falls short of its potential is all. It legitimately is fun, especially in this era where stealth-focused games are less common than ever. I don't want that point to get lost. It's just that the stuff I thought might make it feel unique ended up being pretty negligible. And so we're left with a very polished version of stealth mechanics that you've seen a million times before. And a lot of people will be totally fine with that. But if you are kind of burnt out on hiding in bushes, I don't want to mislead you into thinking this is going to be something meaningfully different. While stealth is good but falls short of its potential, parkour is just kind of bad. With that said, it kind of grew on me a little bit since the preview. The parkour down flips can legitimately be pretty cool, and there were some brief moments where I was holding parkour down, and Naue was doing some really cool descent animations, and it was honestly the closest I felt to Unity's parkour since that game. I may not have liked Unity, but I love the parkour down aspect. It is, once again, exclusively better than Valhalla. Naue is incredibly fast, which is a relief after Eivor and Basim barely felt faster when sprinting. She is much more mobile, the grappling hook accounts for the large overhangs in Japanese architecture, and verticality felt like way more of an advantage than in Valhalla in terms of using it for stealth purposes. Problem is, a lot of this stuff doesn't really matter when there's nothing to climb. I've already complained about the cities and their lack of identity, but from a gameplay perspective, they are just as inert. You could easily argue that these are the least fun cities to parkour in the entire franchise. I get that the buildings were historically just one story tall, I get that they weren't packed together, but as a reminder, real Italian cities don't have dozens of posts sticking out of each building and conveniently placed ramps and roof lifts. It isn't history's job to make these cities fun to traverse, it is the responsibility of the devs, and here it's pretty clear they just decided they weren't really going to try. There are some parkour pathways you can find out in the wild, and it was nice to have stretches of parkour available like this, but you don't do much other than sprint and hold climb. The old games weren't exactly high IQ puzzles to get through either. You can get through most of those old tombs by just holding a few buttons. But at least they had the atmosphere, and they look so cool visually. Here you're just out in the wilderness, climbing rocks. Also, this part really isn't a problem to me, I don't really care, but it's funny that after all the complaining people have been doing about the yellow paint, this game slathers a funny amount on the parkour areas. They really do not trust their level design or the player to figure out where to go. The worst part about parkour since Valhalla has been the tying of sprint to the left stick on a toggle, and this is an atrocious control scheme. I can't believe this is the third straight game where they allowed this to be kept. A toggle system is fine if you're only ever moving in one direction without stopping, but in a game where every few seconds you are jumping or climbing or doing something else that can knock you out of sprint, it feels terrible. I'm sure people are going to map their own control schemes to kind of fix this. I messed around with some myself, but honestly, just like with Mirage, I realized the game isn't built for it. Even when you hold a button to sprint, the game will knock you out of it regularly and you have to press it multiple times during your parkour chain. It sucks so much. Clearly the game is built around the left stick toggle, and it's one of the worst movement changes the series has had in my opinion, and that's saying something. Also, why did you give us all these parkour down animations if the maximum height to trigger them is like 1.5 meters? Anything higher than a single story and now I will just hang off the ledge instead of flip down. In so many instances it feels like they didn't have people testing these systems to see if they were fun, because you can see the inkling of something that is actually cool here, but it's never allowed to come out, and parkour ends up being entirely unmemorable here. The combat, luckily for me because I am tired of complaining, is okay, it's fine. It's not groundbreaking, but I enjoyed it well enough, and once again, clear upgrade over Valhalla. At its core, it works like a lot of these types of games do these days. Dodge the red attack, parry the blue attack, weave in some abilities. But something it has over past games is there are actually some interesting combos you can pull off. Both heavy and light attacks change if you hold the button down to do a posture attack, and each weapon has different things you can do with different button combinations. While Yasuke can't do stealth or parkour especially well, both characters are fun to fight with in my opinion. Yasuke tears through enemy health bars, while Naoe struggles a bit more but has much better mobility and evasion options. The combat showcases a good balance of making the characters different, but still fun, which is something the rest of the game really doesn't hit at all. My only real criticism of the combat is that it doesn't do much new, and while that's not a problem in of itself, every mechanic in the game feels a lot better in other games. We have Ghost of Tsushima and Sekiro where these parries and dodges feel so much meatier and more cinematic, and it's just hard to recommend the combat system here when it feels, in many ways, like a less good version of other stuff that's already out there. Even still, the weapon variety kept me interested, and it is the one aspect of gameplay where switching characters is actually fun. I felt like the combat system had enough depth across both characters to keep me from burning out during my 60 hours, and since I am a stealth guy most of the time, I'm sure there's plenty about the combat I didn't even explore. Gameplay in Shadows overall, like the gameplay loop, is very status quo. It focuses on cleaning up what already existed instead of trying new and exciting things. And what that means is that if you love the last few AC games and what you want out of Shadows is more of that, this will 100% meet that standard. But I think a lot of people out there have been burnt out and frustrated by the repetition of open world gameplay in the modern era, and I think it's important that you know that Shadows has no desire to break that mold in any meaningful way. This is very much more the same, for better and for worse. My longest videos are the ones where I think the story of the game I am covering is so poorly handled that it needs to be analyzed scene by scene. Shadows doesn't require a long story section, but unfortunately, that isn't for exclusively good reasons. Like Mirage and Valhalla before it, the narrative of Shadows is incredibly bland, and it makes a lot of the same mistakes as the last couple games. One of the immediate areas of disappointment was the poor facial capture. Since Odyssey, AC games have sacrificed the cool cinematic cutscenes of the older games for much lazier feeling scenes with no facial capture. There was a reason for this in Odyssey, the addition of player choice. Now it's up to you if that was a worthy sacrifice, but at least I could understand why they did this. It was a necessary change for the type of game they wanted to make. But then Valhalla came out, and there were fewer options for player choice, and the facial animations arguably looked worse than Odyssey, and then Mirage followed it with pretty much no real player choice, and it still failed to look good. If there is no mechanical benefit, it is easy to feel like all this is just laziness on Ubisoft's part. This carries over into Shadows. Player choice exists, but once again it means far less than it did even in Valhalla. Shadows has a function called Canon Mode, where you can remove player choice from the game. I didn't select this because I didn't want to miss out on a mechanic that was built into the experience, and having finished the game, I really don't think you miss anything by just selecting Canon Mode. Choices feel pretty much worthless throughout the narrative. In fact, in some scenes it almost feels insulting that false choices were given at all. In more than one instance, I was confronted by a character who was clearly trying to lie to me, and I got a dialogue option to call them out. But then they offer up some other piece of evidence that proves absolutely nothing, and in fact makes me trust them even less, but my main character now has to believe them because that is the canon answer, making them seem stupid and making the option of choice entirely useless. Odyssey had multiple endings and missable story arcs. Shadows has, at its core, one direction the story can go. And so that brings me back to what I was saying earlier. What did we sacrifice the good facial animations for then? There are moments where this game has legitimately cool choreographed moments. I want to hammer in the fact that it is much more cinematic than Valhalla was, but it is disappointing to see the cinematic presentation held back by a choice mechanic that doesn't even really matter in this game. Then we have the story itself, which I can talk a lot about without spoiling anything. First off, the intro of this game is really long. I said in my preview video that I appreciate how much time this game spends on cutscenes, and I stand by that. I like this game's confidence in its story, but I think the pacing is one of the biggest issues now that I'm able to look back at the whole thing. To give some context as to what I mean, I fully platinumed the game in 60 hours, as I said. You play as both Yasuke and Naoe in the prologue, so as to get an idea of what their story is and how they get caught up in the overarching plot. After the tutorial, the game focuses very specifically on Naoe for a long time, and when I say long, I mean I was 10 hours into the game before Yasuke really entered the story. There are 12 main targets on your target board. You kill 3 of them, a quarter, before Yasuke really matters. And I just don't think the narrative justifies taking so long to get to the point, especially because when we finally do have our full cast of characters, the game fails to use that time to make me care about any of them. Relationships are built up so quickly so as to be entirely unbelievable. One of the main characters is a child named Junjiro who helps out at the hideout, and there are some big early game story beats with his character that do not hit at all because of how little build-up any of these characters got. Even Naoe and Yasuke themselves felt below par as protagonists to me, and this is largely because of that pacing. You can find some nice side scenes where they hang out like normal people, but these are a few minute-long scenes in a 60-hour game, and they are primarily optional, not integrated into the main plot. When I finished that first 10 hours, I was finally in the meat of the game, with access to both Yasuke and Naoe, and free reign to tackle the target board however I liked. And thus, for the next 40 hours, the plot pretty much stopped. Since Origins, the series has had a problem with making its villains masked enemies who only show up in their specific arc and have little to no personality until they are uncovered. They're introduced with this awesome scene where they look so cool and I wanted to know more about them, but this intro ends up being the only memorable moment most of them get. Gun to my head, I could not name more than one of these villains looking back at this cutscene now. You get no chance to care about them because their stories are entirely insulated from the rest of the plot, and we basically just get the arc system from Valhalla again, which sucked. Just like with that system, when you can do the story in any order, it is hard to have any kind of growth or progression. The characters and their relationships stagnate, and the mystery at the center of the story goes nowhere. It started feeling like a joke, because every time you kill a character, Naoe tries to interrogate them, and they literally tell you nothing, for, again, like 40 hours. What makes all of this even more disappointing is that these targets have different level gates, so there is a clear order that most people will go through these arcs anyways. It's just like the choice problem. If you're gonna make these choices mean so little, why make us deal with the consequences anyways? They could have just made this more linear and gave us a straightforward story. And so the question is, does the story ever get good? And the honest answer is yes. The story legitimately got interesting and pulled me in. At about hour 50. I hit the credits at hour 55. While the marketing led me to believe that Assassins and Templars would be a major factor in this game like they were in Mirage, and unlike Odyssey and Valhalla, we really don't get direct Assassin Templar lore until the last 5 hours of the game, and at that point, it switches around the pacing problem. Naoe essentially goes off on her own personal journey to end her arc, while Yasuke pretty much solves the entire finale of the game. It's all about him at that point. It adds to this feeling like these were two separate people who happened to be in the same places at the same time, and not real partners working toward the same goals. All of their best respective moments happen very separately. And that's kind of it. I was really never angry at this story, like I was in games like Unity or Valhalla, but there's just so little to talk about. There were so few moments where I cared about anything that was happening. There is so much space in a 60-hour game to give us meaningful character moments, and instead I'd say that 60 to 70% of the game is spent going after targets with pretty much no narrative progression. I was disappointed because, again, the game is so much more cinematic and well done than the last few games, but it never prioritized its characters and plot enough to make me care. I'm thinking I'm just going to title this video Assassin's Creed Shadows Post-Platinum Review or something like that. And my intent there isn't to be mysterious or anything, it's just that with other AC games, there's always some standout thing, positive or negative, that I want at the center of my discussion that I usually turn into my title. I don't really have much that stood out in Shadows. I don't have a central pervading problem with the game that would lead me to say it's not worth your time, but the issue is I don't have any reason you really should play the game either. I talked earlier about Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring, and regardless of how you feel about those games, it's clear that a lot of the praise they get comes from the perception that they do what they can to subvert the Ubisoft formula, making it more about the wonder of exploration and less about checking off boxes. Shadows does the total opposite. It takes the Ubisoft formula, all the good and bad, and polishes it to a mirror sheen, leaving us with a very well-made game that exemplifies all of the repetition the formula is infamous for. Shadows just won't get videos like these, championing the intricacies of its world design, because outside of the visuals, it has no desire to be that kind of game. But as a reminder, as much hate as Ubisoft Formula games get in many circles, they remain immensely popular. What might burn out someone who intakes half a dozen of these games per year may delight someone who just wants to walk along the coast of Lake Biwa in the spring. I've had some posts from the AC Shadows subreddit on my feed, and a lot of people seem to love the game, and that's great. I can see why. But I'm not trying to be unfair or to bring Ubisoft down when I say I just don't agree. I can clearly see that the devs of this game worked hard to listen to fans after criticisms of Valhalla. It is a well-made game in many respects, with some of the most technologically impressive landscapes in this industry. But no amount of polish can cover up repetitive open-world content, a barely there story, and lifeless cities, problems that are not new to AC. And so I will reiterate the point of criticism I provided in my intro, one that some people might think is even harsher than the things I said about Valhalla, which is that I just don't see myself remembering anything about Shadows 1 year from now. If you don't mind a turn-off-your-brain game, then I'm sure you could have fun with it. But for now, I would recommend waiting for a sale. That is all I have for right now. I had hoped to get this video out by release, but I wanted to have a full opinion before I put anything out. And like I've said before, I only get a couple hours after work every day to work on these videos, so I just gave myself the rest of the week. I have made a lot of AC videos in a row since for whatever reason I decided to do the whole Ezio trilogy one after the other, so whatever I make next probably won't be AC related. Which also probably means no one's going to watch it, but that's fine, you don't have to. An indie game of the month, this is a more popular one, but I played Transistor recently. If you ever wanted to check out what Supergiant were up to before Hades, I think the game still holds up, and you can really see how the build crafting elements here would evolve into the more complicated roguelike stuff we see in Hades, so I had a lot of fun with it. Anyways, if you have anything about Shadows you want to chat about, just let me know in the comments or over email, but otherwise, have a great day, and take care of yourself. Alright, so I didn't know where to put this, but you can bash your way through any of the sliding doors in this game, and I never got tired of it. So, scratch what I said earlier, that's the hook of the game, this is why you should buy it. It's just silly, I like it.